Chapter 3. Death. Karen and I stood on the sidewalk in front of the variety store, spellbound by the women's clothes. Eventually, we worked our way to the lingerie display and stopped, staring in wonder at the flimsy articles. "I've got to get a bra," Karen said out of the blue. I looked at her. "Mom won't get me one," she went on. "She says I'm too young." We were both 12. "But I really need one." She blushed ever so slightly and giggled. I giggled too, because I certainly didn't need one. "Let's go get one," I said with a toss of the head. I grabbed her hand and led her to the swinging door. The women's things were in the back and to the right. "You wait here," I said to her. She knew my reputation. "I'll be back in a minute." I went nonchalantly to the lingerie counter, stopping now and then to look at something in the glass case. I reached a rack holding brassieres of all shapes and sizes, from misses to matrons. I spotted the smallest one there. It was at the end. With a quick look around, I took it off the rack, examined it for several seconds, looked around again, and slipped it under my jacket. I started toward the front, not rushing so as to attract attention, and could see Karen on the other side, fidgeting quite noticeably. She had watched the whole thing. So had someone else. One of the clerks. She cut me off as I turned to the door. "Just a minute, young lady." Panic filled my throat, and I thought I was going to be sick. I've been caught. "Let me see what you have under your jacket." There was nothing to do but to hand it over. The lady called the store manager, who took me to his office and sent for the police. The manager pressed me to identify my accomplice, recognizing immediately that the bra was not for me. But Karen had stayed in the background and was undetected. I was handed over to a policeman. We rode in silence to my home as my mind whirred over my prospects. Could I jump out of the car and run? No, I'd get killed. Could I make up a story that would convince my mother? No. The police are always right. What could I do? Nothing. We stood just inside the front door as the young officer, who didn't crack a smile throughout it all, told my mother what had happened. He spoke of my being sent to juvenile hall if I were caught again. Mom began to cry, jerking both hands to her face momentarily, and then to her chest. I started to cry. The tears were real, but they were angry. For the first time, the policeman betrayed emotion and, embarrassed, quietly backed out the door. My tears increased, and I rubbed my eyes with clenched fists. I clenched them tighter. They'll never catch me again, I thought. I'll never get caught again. I immediately remembered a similar vow nearly 9 years earlier when I was between 3 and 4 years old. I'll never get caught stealing again. I had sobbed after being soundly spanked by my father. I was caught on my first venture as a thief. It was Christmas time and we were at grandmother's house. We called her Momo. Without announcement, I walked to the corner store with nothing more than curiosity on my mind. It was a fascinating place. I walked in, unintentionally quiet and unnoticed. In fact, nobody seemed to be around. And there was the candy counter, with every kind of gum and penny candy imaginable lying right out in front. Again, with little forethought, I reached up and helped myself to 4 penny Tootsie Rolls and strolled out, still unnoticed. Back at Grandmother's house, I opened one of the Tootsie Rolls and bit joyfully into it. My dad watched me open the wrapper and wolf down the first piece before asking me, "Susan, where did you get the candy?" A chill gripped me. "At the store," I said. "I found 4 pennies on the ground and bought the candy with those." My father didn't accept the story, and I eventually acknowledged that I had stolen the candy. He took me by the hand and rather roughly walked me back to the store. Inside, he said to the elderly store owner, "My daughter here took 4 pieces of candy from your store a few minutes ago. Now she wants to return 3 of the pieces, and here's a penny for the 4th. The old man looked at me. He had a white, bushy mustache and very soft brown eyes. He didn't smile, but his eyes twinkled. Anger showed in my father's face and voice. "What do you say, Susan?" he asked. "I'm sorry I took your candy without paying." I looked at his neck rather than his eyes, and I was humiliated. By the time I reached the 3rd grade, I was the best shoplifter in my neighborhood. I had a strong reputation among all the kids, and that put me at the center of our loosely structured gang. If anyone needed clothes for her dolls, I could get them for nothing at the 5 and 10-cent store. And I moved on to small items of clothing and accessories. But I left the gum, candy, and soda pop for the boys in the gang. They took care of the heavier things for our after-school parties. I maintained mostly A's in school until the 5th grade, and then my downhill slide began. Up to that point, I mixed a number of wholesome activities with my escapades and presented at least a facade of respectability. There were brownie meetings when I was younger, and then came Girl Scouts as I reached out more and more for a sense of belonging. One of my favorite times came during walks through the vineyard on the way to the old mission house where we held our scout meetings. I walked as though in a trance through the rows upon rows of vines, approaching the big old house at the center of the vineyard. I was in a fairy tale, warm and secure, on my way to my friends. And then came boys and parties, more fun and freedom. But school was suffocating me. My first male teacher was a pushover, a soft touch. I had him around my finger. Why work? So my A average faded and then evaporated in the 5th grade. Finally, the assistant school principal called me to his office one day. "Susan," he said, his prominent jaw sticking out even farther in his closed-mouthed firmness, "you've completely fallen apart. You're failing just about everything in sight." If he wasn't going to smile, neither was I. I stared into his eyes, but he outlasted me. "I'm trying as hard as I can," I lied. "I try to do all the work, but I just seem to be having a bad time." He interrupted. "It's so bad that you're not going to pass. You're not going to make it into the 6th grade. You're going to have to repeat the 5th grade." I was stunned, and my tough look crumbled. Tears filled my eyes, but I was determined not to cry. I didn't succeed. Tears slipped from my straining eyes as the news sank in. I would not move on with my friends. I'd be left behind. I was humiliated again in front of everybody. The second year of the 5th grade was no better from my point of view, and not much better from the school's. I passed, but my enthusiasm reached bottom. Boys and physical education, they were okay, in that order. English, arithmetic, geography, ugh. My second brush with death began when I was 14 years old. My father did not look into my face. Twisting his hands together, he then stiffened them and let them go limp. I knew what was coming. Mother had been in the hospital too long. There had been too many wrong diagnoses. Mom's got cancer, he said, finally, simply. They say it's terminal. She's not going to make it. Panic surged into my throat. A bitter taste rose into my mouth. He continued to talk, but I didn't know what he was saying. My whole body shook, starting from my legs, then up into my torso, and then my arms. I was very cold. What about Stevie and me? I thought, trying to hold my hands still. They quivered perceptibly. Mike had enlisted in the Navy, as it became obvious American involvement in Southeast Asia was not decreasing, but Steve and I were still there. What will we do? I said to myself, knowing Dad couldn't cope with us. Our house grew quiet in those autumn days of 1963. It was quiet and gray, especially before Mom was finally brought home and everything was left to her pain pills. I scrambled around the kitchen in the mornings and the evenings, trying to cook, to wash clothes, to cheer up Steve, trying to squeeze my way into the in crowd at school, but never making it, trying to find out what God was doing to me. By mid-fall, I was exhausted, and my schoolwork plummeted into nothingness. I was standing by the stove in the early evening as the outside darkness enveloped and then penetrated our house. I was tired and angry. In a flash, I understood my anger. I was mad at my mother for being sick. I was mad at my father because I didn't think he understood what a load I was carrying. I was mad at Steve because he needed so much help. I was mad at myself because of my resentment toward my own dying mother. She's just let go, I thought. She's just dying. I don't understand why. Why does she have to die? I'd only seen one person die, and that had taken place quickly. Mom was dying right before my eyes, a bit each day. She was beautiful, I thought, but now she's ugly. I didn't like what I was thinking. I didn't like the flames of resentment consuming me within. I didn't like myself at all. During this period of bitterness and regret, Sergeant Wright, the pastor of the Cambrian Park Methodist Church, began to stop by our house regularly. Dad knew him from the time he had led the Boy Scout troop at the church. "Why don't you come to church, Susan?" he asked me once. I didn't know how to handle his bluntness, so I said I would go. Week after week I went, hoping it might do something to change things. I even joined the choir and often volunteered as a babysitter for the nursery during church services. One afternoon, I walked into the house after school and saw Mr. Wright standing alongside Mom in her bed in a room at the rear of the house. His head was bowed. Mom's eyes were closed. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I assumed they were praying. When Mr. Wright left, he took my hand and held it for a moment, then smiled and walked out. That night, Mom seemed to be smiling all the time. She even laughed out loud when she and Dad were talking alone. It seemed that her room had gone from gray to bright blue and yellow and pink and even orange. It was the third week in December when the young people in the choir met at the church to go caroling. I was happy when I joined them, ready to go to the houses of the old people and entertain them with carols. We piled into 3 cars and set off in the cold, biting air. But there was no snow. There was no snow, but it was cold. The kids said very little as we drove along until we reached my school. They saw me look at it, and traces of smiles began to show on their faces, but they were secretive. We turned the corner onto my street, and I knew where we were going. Instantly, my eyes filled with tears, and I was unable to see. The car stopped in front of my house, and the kids put their fingers to their lips and said, "Be quiet now. We want to surprise her." They had come to sing for my dying mother. I was crying openly as I rushed into the house and told Mom to look out the window onto the patio. They were there, 14 teenagers, boys and girls, forming a semicircle outside the window. We turned on the outside light, and they began to sing Silent Night. Tears streamed down my mother's face. Dad was crying too. I grabbed Steve's hand and squeezed it tight. We all joined hands and laughed and cried and laughed and applauded as they sang 6 of the prettiest Christmas carols I had ever heard. The kids left without me, and I stayed with Mom for several minutes. She was smiling and happy, but she was quiet. She took my hand and drew me to her. "Dear little Susan," she said softly. "Dear little Susan, it's been so hard on you." She looked at me silently for a moment. "I've asked God to let me stay with you until the new year." I was suddenly stone cold. "I'm sure he will," she smiled. "He's been so good to us tonight. I'm sure he'll let us have the holidays together." My mother died on January 9th, 1964.